This week on Act Out, legal wins against herbicides and pesticides are often just the beginning of more battles and could fall short of the necessary change to protect our land and our soil. Next, the number of refugees worldwide is the highest it's ever been since the UN started keeping track some 70 years ago. As the US perpetuates war, climate change, and bolsters fascism here at home, we cannot turn away from the reality that we're creating. Finally, Vanessa Beck with the Black Alliance for Peace joins us to talk about the 1033 program and the Empire's militant home game. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. A Norwich flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. We've all seen the celebratory headlines: glyphosate banned, community bans pesticides, you can't spray here, and other feel-good stories that suggest the battle against poisons being sprayed willy-nilly throughout our communities is going quite well. Well, unfortunately, it's really not as easy as all that. As the saying goes, a law is only as good as its enforcement, something that will definitely resonate with those who have won injunctions, for example, against dirty energy projects, only to see oil and gas literally roll over them and continue their destruction of people and planet for profit. In a recent report for Nation of Change, Meg Wilcox outlines the realities of so-called victories against pesticides, noting that winning in court is less of a one-and-done win and more of a gateway to more battles. State-level preemption laws, resistance from implementing agencies, and lax EPA rules can lead to policies that simply sit on a shelf or are challenged in court. One particularly interesting thing to note here is the state preemption law. Yet another way for the chemicals industry to override the will of the people, this legislation targets the rights of localities to pass laws governing the use of pesticides on land within their jurisdiction. Essentially, preemption laws force communities to defer to state laws, which typically defer to federal laws, meaning the EPA. And if you've been watching the unbelievable anti-science dumb shittery emanating from Trump's EPA, like cutting clean air regulations to give coal a boost, you'll probably be feeling a bit uneasy about this forced deferral. Preemption laws have allowed chemical companies to keep spraying in communities that have legally banned them, based on the fact that, according to the state, according to the EPA, spraying poison is still totally legal, which would be like a town thousands of miles away from where you live saying that they've legalized at-will beheadings because they're getting a nice payout from the sword industry, so you're gonna have to toughen up and ready yourselves for some crazy assholes with swords riding through your town and beheading people. Of course, that makes for a crazier spectacle, but the analogy holds. Actually, with pesticides, it's even scarier because at least with beheadings, you really can see the results. For those living in communities that have banned pesticide use, you'd likely think, hey, we're all right. We banned that. My kids can play on that grass and roll around in that field. We're fine. And even for the engaged citizen, preemption laws aren't something that we typically consider when working on local bans. But here again, we see the need for widening the lens so as to recognize the bigger picture that these industries and for-sale politicos work in. And many have. Several states have taken aim at preemption laws, including Massachusetts, Minnesota, Connecticut, and Illinois. And yet, if your state doesn't prescribe to the preemption shit show, you still have to keep tabs on the various agencies that are tasked with enforcing and or implementing these new pesticide bans. For instance, agencies will often claim that it's too hard to manage parkland without the use of herbicides or pesticides, even using children's safety as a shield for inaction. Elle Goldberg, a public health activist in Massachusetts, explained, in Newton, the Parks Department said kids could trip on weeds and hurt their knees on the rocks if they didn't use herbicides. They quoted pesticide manufacturers' claims that the pesticides were safe to justify using poisons on playgrounds and playing fields. You know, because tripping on weeds is way worse than falling face first into a petri dish of cancer-causing chemicals. And there again, you find yourself circling back to the EPA. Because according to the EPA, glyphosate, for instance, is no biggie. It has no, quote, public health risk. Meanwhile, not only have multiple courts in multiple parts of the world found glyphosate to be a carcinogen, already back in 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, concluded that glyphosate is a carcinogen. So really, the only jury that's still out on whether or not it's a good idea to spray poison all over the damn place is the one working for the poison manufacturers, either directly or indirectly via public office. Still, while folks continue to fight against poisons, the focus for many has actually shifted. Just as we need to widen the lens to see how bigger agencies and industries affect our local issue, we also should look beyond just one herbicide or pesticide. The goal, after all, isn't just to ban one poison and bring in another. The goal is to have healthy land, and below it, healthy soil. Drew Tower, Community Resource and Policy Director at Beyond Pesticides, explained that shifting from a mindset of feeding grass to feeding the soil builds the soil's microbial diversity, and that helps the system withstand weed and pest pressures. Plus, it has multiple beneficial bottom lines for human health, water quality, and pollinator populations. In other words, rather than trying to ban one poison at a time or relying on organic pesticides, which aren't totally benign, anti-pesticide initiatives should broaden their horizons and consider the larger ecosystems that they're trying to preserve and protect. This will then in turn highlight the intersections of that work and open up possibilities for collaboration and strengthening. Because soil health is actually a clean water issue, which is actually a larger environmental issue, which is a racial justice issue, which is an income inequality issue. The connections we can and should make are manifold. And with that, the tactics must also be many and varied. We need a cohesive systems approach that doesn't just rely on, for instance, legal bans. Be it climate justice, racial justice, or pesticides, we can't just pass legislation and hope that it'll save us. And I'm not saying any of this to be a downer, to say, fuck using the courts as a tool. I'm saying, know what you're getting. Know what using the courts means. Don't rest on laurels or legalese. Don't rest on any one tactic. Consider what other tactics, what other angles we need to work. Consider how to more broadly address an issue without losing power, without losing people. You can't build a house with only a hammer. And for the future we want to build, the future that we dream about, we need a well-stocked, ever-improving toolbox. Next up, the fight against U.S. imperialism continues. And although embassy protectors were illegally removed from the Venezuelan embassy in D.C. in May, their fight continues as well. On July 9th, the 4 embassy protectors arrested during the raid will be in court, facing up to a year in prison and $100,000 in fines. They're asking for folks to donate in order to cover these legal fees in this ongoing process. Check out popularresistance.org in order to get a recap of their resistance and also to donate to their fund. Meanwhile, as those standing in the way of the sadistic bulldozer that is U.S. imperialism face jail time and horrendous fees, those perpetuating death, destruction, and displacement, well, they just get a green light. A recent report by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees reveals that the number of refugees worldwide is now the highest it's ever been since the UN began keeping records, with more than 70 million people seeking refuge after being forced from their homes. The UN noted in its report that this number, 70.8 million, is a conservative estimate. Of this conservative estimate of 70 million, half are children. This news came just 2 days after Trump announced that ICE would begin forcefully deporting millions of immigrants via violent raids throughout the U.S. An announcement he later backpedaled on, saying he would delay these raids, although it's important to keep in mind that raids have never actually stopped. Meanwhile, another recent report shows that 2,000 migrant children have been kidnapped and detained by the U.S. in just a little over a month. Also last week, Trump announced the conversion of a former man camp into a detention center for migrant children in Texas. The company slated to run this new facility is the same company responsible for the Tornillo Child Jail, the creative opposition to which we've also covered on this show. Yet another child jail is slated to open in Oklahoma at Fort Sill, the site of a former Japanese internment camp, which before that was a detention center for Apache indigenous peoples during the late 1800s. The site has also housed a former boarding school for Native children, places made infamous for their mental and physical abuse. In short, we're quite literally recycling concentration camps. And don't even cringe at that phrase. The words "never again" hold no meaning if we do not make a comparative analysis of the horrors we are creating today. Are these camps the same as the Nazi death camps? Of course not. Are they the same as the Japanese camps? No. As the saying goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And the conditions that created Nazi death camps will never be the same. We are in a different time, but we haven't evolved. These American detention centers, these camps, represent the same forced detainment without access to judicial proceedings that framed the camps of the past. And as we've covered on this show before, immigrant detention centers in this country have continuously displayed human rights abuses that include physical, mental, and sexual assault. Just this past week, the Justice Department went to court in order to argue that it shouldn't be required to give detained migrant children toothbrushes, soap, towels, showers, or even half a night's sleep inside Border Patrol detention facilities. The case in front of the three-panel judge dealt with Obama-era conditions where migrants in Rio Grande Valley facilities were hungry, with some eating only sandwiches of 2 pieces of dry bread and 1 slice of ham. They were thirsty, with up to 20 migrants sharing the same cup to drink from the water cooler. They were embarrassed to use a toilet in front of 50 other people, and they couldn't take a shower or brush their teeth or even wash their hands with soap and dry them with a towel, the judge found. At night, they couldn't sleep. The lights were left on as they shivered beneath aluminum blankets on the concrete floor. But let's avoid using the term concentration camp, because at least we haven't gassed anyone yet, right? Shying away from that phrase does not change or mitigate atrocities. It only saves us from seeing ourselves in the harsh light of reality lit by the horrors of the past. It saves us from the legitimate comparison between the past and our current path. It gives us a pass to do nothing, because, we're not that bad. But as Mike Ishii, a descendant of Japanese immigrants forced into camps during World War II, told Newsweek recently, what is happening now is part of a historical pattern. We're drawing attention to the history of what has happened to children before in indigenous communities and in the Japanese American community, so that people can start to realize that this is not something new. This past Sunday, June 23rd, Ishii organized a protest outside of Fort Sill where survivors of the internment camps and their descendants, both Japanese and Native American, joined together to protest the new plans, connecting their experiences to the present. One woman, for instance, held a picture of herself as a child which read, "Concentration Camp Survivor." Protesters carried and draped tsuru, origami cranes, as signs of solidarity. Survivors' shirts read, "Stop repeating history." In an almost too fitting display of the angry idiocy of fascism, military police threatened and yelled at the protesters, several of whom are obviously in their 80s, yelling, "You need to move right now. What don't you understand? It's English. Get out." Get out. Incidentally, exactly what we say to refugees. What we said back during the Holocaust to Jews fleeing from Europe. Get out. But that's like yelling at a bruise that forms when someone kicks the shit out of you. The bruise is just the effect, how your body responds to the violent impact, and likewise, refugees are the effect of the violent impact of U.S. imperialism. And as we covered last week, the rise in climate refugees cannot be separated from our gas-guzzling wars. As hard as it is, as disgusting and annoying and shitty as it is, we have to deal with the cause, or we can't deal with the effect. And even if we do, as we should, address our horrific immigration and refugee policies, we will not stem the flow. We will not stop the violence that creates these migrants, that creates refugees. And that's what we have to do. Because if we don't, we'll not only see more refugees, we'll see more children in cages. We'll see more fascist extremism, because if there's anything that fuels fascism, it is the idiotic, shallow, and back-asswards analysis of a deep problem that always traces back to their own fear, their own hatred. So the more we back away from the harsh light of reality, the more we back into corners and let fear strangle our minds and suffocate our souls, the more refugees we'll create, the more fascists we will create, the more concentration camps we will create. History is screaming at us, and the future is screaming back. There's a lot we can do now, organize, as many communities are, to protect our neighbors from kidnapping, detention, and deportation, blocking and protesting at detention centers, ICE, and Border Patrol facilities. We can, should, and must do more, and we can do most by putting an end to the situations that create refugees. Finally today, the 1033 program is the droll and inappropriately benign name given to the program that transfers military equipment from the U.S. Armed Forces to the police. The program gained national infamy around the time of Ferguson protests thanks to the heavy artillery cops paraded around and used against unarmed Black Lives Matter activists. Since then, it's sort of fallen off the radar. There have even been some false reports that Obama scrapped the entire program during his presidency. Spoiler alert, he didn't. Here to talk more about this home game of U.S. imperialism is Vanessa Beck, coordinating committee member and research coordinator for the Black Alliance for Peace. Take a look. How does this work in terms of how police departments get the gear? Like, what's the process there?
Seems pretty simple. Since unfortunately, since it's a federal program, it's not like, your city council or your state representatives, these agencies don't even have to go to them. It's a pretty simple process online, where these departments can say, this is what we want.
And there's no oversight with those state reps or with the city council. They can't say, actually, we don't think that you need a grenade launcher.
No, I mean, there have been some cases, most notably, I would say, in LA, where people have organized, particularly around school districts. There are public school districts that have these weapons of mass destruction. So, the case that I'm most familiar with, which was in a county in LA, it was a collaboration, a coalition that involved convincing, parents and teachers and other community organizations that they wanted the police in that area, the school district police, to return the weapons and no longer participate in the program.
So talk about, there's a misconception, because some people might be wondering why we're talking about this now, because there's a misconception that Obama ended the 1033 program, when in fact, reports suggest that the value of equipment distributed to police departments actually went up in the year following Obama's so-called ban. So what was this ban that is miscommunicated as having ended the 1033 program?
Yeah, there was an actual very temporary ban, I believe in 2014, but it didn't last very long. And then Obama passed legislation that limited the trade of the transfer of a few kinds of weapons, but yeah, it did nothing. Honestly, it was a huge betrayal between Obama and the Congressional Black Caucus. More weapons were transferred to local police under the Obama administration than under any other president's administration. And here we can also really see the connection between U.S. imperialism, abroad on, people who the U.S. has tried to colonize, and the militarism here, because there was a 2,400% increase in military equipment transferred to U.S. police departments under Obama, and at the same time there was a 1,900 increase in U.S. military presence in Africa.
Wow.
So, I mean, this was it's absolutely a myth and a lie that Obama was looking out for Black folks here or elsewhere in the diaspora.
Yeah, which is interesting because I assume that's with regards to AFRICOM, that 1,900% increase. And it's also interesting because we had Netfa on the program, Netfa Freeman, discussing the link between AFRICOM and the continued oppression of Black and brown folks in this country. So the 1033 program is basically just, because people oftentimes think of like imperialism or militarism being something that happens elsewhere. But really the 1033 program is a direct and very obvious example of how U.S. militarization and white supremacy is very much a home game.
Yes. Very, very well said. Like you said, there isn't this like line of demarcation, whether we're being targeted, in Africa or in Baltimore or, Southeast DC.
So I'm also curious because now we're obviously in Trump's presidency now, and what's changed in that 1033 program. There's back in 2017, reports said, Trump reinstates the 1033 program, which is a poor way of putting that because, as you stated, it never died anyway. But what has changed, if anything, under Trump's presidency with regards to the 1033 program? Very, very little. I mean, the whatever Obama said, whatever Obama did to make it a little bit harder to receive certain weapons, Trump simply removed that. And there's also a misconception that like the 1033 program is targeted for, like the bigger cities like LA and things like that. But there are like small police departments that also obviously have access. I mean, there's no, yes. It's not like about whether your department is big enough to handle an MRAP. Like there are police departments that are very small that have access to these weapons as well. It's kind of like,
yes,
anybody really.
Yeah, it is. School districts have access, park districts. They don't even need to justify, we have this amount of crime, and so we need these. Yeah, there's no correlation between any sort of like pretend need and acquiring the weapons.
So talk about pushes or moves to address the 1033 program, either via Black Alliance for Peace or other ways.
Black Alliance for Peace is working on developing a domestic campaign that's the counterpart to our campaign to shut down AFRICOM and all U.S. Foreign military bases. So we're in communication with organizations that are already, working on aspects of militarization and repression, and we want to develop a national coordinating committee or steering committee to focus on ending 1033, ending the police exchanges with Israel called the Deadly Exchange Program, as well as issues around mass incarceration. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel. There's already people really doing really excellent work on the ground, but we we want to aid in the kind of the coordination and the focus of that work, so that we have more power.
Well, and you bring up that important point again of connecting those issues, not reinventing the wheel, but maybe bringing the wheels together to work and going the same direction. Because it does seem like there are oftentimes people talking about these disparate issues, but not bringing them together in that way. Is there a way to find out? Because, for example, you live in Baltimore, and you had put up a post a while back, discussing what Baltimore has gained and lost thanks to the 1033 program. Is there a way for folks to access that information? Like, can they look and see, hey, is my police department partaking in this?
Yes, there finally is some transparency, and I found 2 websites that you can enter your city or your zip code. The one where you can look at your actually state, and then you can scroll down and look at all the different like local police agencies. That's the Marshall program. I'm not sure if I have the URL with me, but if if you just look up the Marshall program 1033, there's another one called Open the Books, and if you search for that one is really great, because you can enter a zip code and it'll show you a map with any spot in that area that has received some of these weapons, and it'll list individually like 10 Glocks and the amount that's worth, or bomb throwing robot and the amount that's worth,
because that's necessary.
Yeah.
To learn more about the work that the Black Alliance for Peace does, which covers issues from healthcare to imperialism to education to the prison industrial complex, a truly intersectional organization. To learn more, visit blackallianceforpeace.com. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Thank you so much for watching. Reminder, please, please, please sign up for our newsletter, because it is the best way to stay up to date on all of our episodes. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please do keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. Until next week, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some roster through. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and served my shove. I'm not a violent man, but